Thank you very much, all distinguished guests, especially the foreign delegates, and IFJ President Mr. Jim Boumelha. Now I will request for Mr. Jim to please deliver his speech.
Thank you very much, Amin. Good morning, colleagues. I will start this talk by borrowing a quote from Harold Evans. Harold Evans was the editor of the London Times, and he said at some point on the question of killing of journalists that the price of truth has gone up grievously. Every week we pay with the life of a reporter, a cameraman, a support worker, and unless the life is of that of well-known Western correspondents, the world barely notices. And many people have heard of the Russian colleague, the investigative journalist Anna Politkovskaya. She was shot dead in October 2006 in the elevator of her apartment building. But how many people outside the Sindhi-speaking area of Pakistan have heard of Ghulam Rasool Birhaman, a reporter from the daily Sindhu Hyderabad who was abducted, tortured, and left for dead in May 2010 after reporting on an arranged tribal marriage involving a Iran. So I could go on and on and on and on about citing people that died and nobody has ever heard of them. And we in the IFJ, we publish an annual report on the killed journalists every January, like this one. I brought a few with me here. And you can just go to the IFJ website and you can read what we have been reporting since our record began. The last one that we published in 2014, we listed 135 journalists and news media personnel who were killed, with Pakistan topping the poll, fortunately, with 14 killed. And the first shocking thing about this report is to learn just how many died. And it's not new. When we aggregate all the statistics, we find that over a decade, more than 1,000 journalists have died. That comes to about 2 journalists or media workers dying every week. And the second shocking thing is to learn how many of the murdered are local beat reporters whose name, as I said, do not resonate with the media. These are different from the byline war correspondent who knowingly risk their lives. And every conflict press is victim. By the way, Iraq has been the highest number of victims. Over 350 journalists died since the invasion by the coalition of the Americans. And nearly 3 out of the 4 journalists killed around the world did not step on the landmine or get shot in a crossfire or even die in a suicide bombing attack. And instead, no less than 70% of journalists killed on the job were murdered outright, such as killed by a gunman escaping on the back of a motorcycle, shot or stabbed to death near their home or their office, or found dead after being abducted and tortured. So the pattern of most journalists murdered in reprisal for their work, as opposed to being killed by the hazard of combat reporting, holds true even in war zones. In Somalia, more than half of the journalists killed didn't die in anything like a firefight or a bombing attack. Instead, they were individually murdered. Similarly, in Afghanistan, outright homicide accounted for over 50% of journalists killed. And in Iraq, it's 65% of journalists killed since the invasion. So to wider global context of the statistics, the research of the IFJ has revealed that only 1 in 4 news media staff died covering war and armed conflict. As I said, the great majority died in peacetime, working in their own country. Only 1 in 8 of their killers were prosecuted, and in 2/3 of the cases, the killers were not even identified, and probably will never be. This means that it is almost virtually risk-free to kill a journalist. Murder has become the easiest, cheapest, and more effective way of silencing troublesome journalists. Occasionally, a triggerman is identified and brought to trial, but in most cases, the paymaster goes free. And the repercussion of these murders also stretch beyond the incident themselves. As we know, the murder of a journalist sent a signal to countless others that they or members of their family could be next. Many journalists have been threatened, sometimes repeatedly, before being murdered. Countless of the journalists have been warned not to travel the same path. Murdering some journalists while threatening to target even more generates fear that is hard to measure. Self-censorship has become routine in nations all over the world, from Colombia to Mexico. And all this report that made grim readings when we're confronted by the scandal of impunity and the failure of governments to bring the killers to justice. And it is easy to draw the conclusion that the cause is absolutely hopeless. And in their names, almost every day we try to find ways of making journalism safer, and we feel that we are responsible for their safety. And as such, we have for many years now, whenever we can, given urgent support to journalists and media staff in conflict areas through rapid safety training. Of course, we cannot train all the journalists of the world. We've tried to force, through our negotiations, leading international media organizations like the BBC, Reuters, CNN, and major newspaper groups to push health and safety into the mainstream of international media development strategies. And most importantly, the high level of media death cries out for more action by international institutions such as the United Nations, where we play a part, and we try to force governments to pay more attention to the safety crisis faced by journalists. UNESCO, as I'm sure you know, is the UN specialized agency with a mandate to defend and promote freedom of expression and press freedom. And it agrees with us that the question of safety of journalists and how to combat impunity is a fundamental prerequisite for achieving freedom of expression and democracy. And it has at its disposal tools and instruments, including international humanitarian laws, universal human rights laws, covenants, declarations, resolutions, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Convention, including this famous additional protocol 1, which deals with journalists, resolutions, Security Council Resolution 1738, and I will deal with that in detail at some point, declaration, and a plethora of them. All these instruments make it clear that journalists, including embedded journalists, I know we're going to be talking about that, are civilians, and must therefore be protected as such. And also they compel governments to abide by international laws and standards, including the universal humanitarian laws, which is a set of universal standards for all people and nations. And if you take the Geneva Convention, as I mentioned, in fact there are 4 conventions, and they were adopted a long time ago in 1949, and there are 2 additional protocols that are important for journalists that were adopted much later in 1977. They make a distinction between civilians and combatants, and between civilian objects and military objects. And most important for journalists, they ensure that a certain category of people and objects must receive additional protection. Journalists are considered civilians, but on top of that, and the particular article of the first additional protocol, they receive additional protection. And it is because it's based on the fact that in time of conflict, journalists normally undergo more danger than any other citizens. And as I said last night, today's sad reality is that many journalists can rely on this international institution to defend their rights when they disappear or are jailed or are murdered. And the record of government in too many states is appalling. You will have at the end of the spectrum somebody like Gambia, which I'm sure you've heard about, ruled by a completely mad dictator, one of the last dictators remaining in Africa, where journalists have been targeted and jailed, pressed, and in response to the international campaign, this particular president, Yahya Jammeh, his name is, he declared publicly, and that's coming from the president, I will kill anybody called tarnishing the image of my government. I will kill you, and nothing will come out of it. So that is one side of the spectrum. The other side of the spectrum, you will find the United States, one of the world's leading democracies, which has refused consistently to carry out credible and independent investigation of the killing of journalists at the Palestine Hotel, back that during the war, and elsewhere in Iraq. And we have catalogued, not only us, many other NGOs that work with us, 16 other cases of journalists who have died since March 2003 at the hand of US soldiers in Iraq. We have led protests to the US authorities every year on April 4th, which took place on April 4th, 2004, which have gone nowhere. When the world's leading democracy refuses to prosecute those responsible for serious violation, what chance have we got when we confront the likes of President Jammeh of the Gambia? And in December 2006, we're full of hope that the UN Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 1738, stating for the first time that journalists and media professionals engaged in areas of armed conflict shall be respected and protected. And although legal scholars have various opinions on this question, in general, the resolution adopted by the Security Council acting under the Charter of the UN are considered binding in accordance with particular articles. And I'm not going to, I don't think I'm going to waste your time. If you just spend a few minutes considering this in detail. These particular resolutions start by reaffirming that states, parties to the Geneva Convention, are obliged to track persons, and I quote, alleged to have committed or to have ordered to be committed a grave breach of this convention, and an obligation to try them before their own courts, regardless of their nationality. The resolution expresses deep concern, and I quote, at the frequency of acts of violence in many parts of the world against journalists and media workers, in particular, deliberate attacks in violation of international humanitarian law. The body of this particular resolution contained 12 sections, and I would cite what I consider to be the most important. Section 2 record that journalists, media workers engaged in missions reporting, that is, in area of armed conflict, should be considered, as I said, as civilians and should be respected and protected as such. Section 3 record that media equipment and installation constitute civilian objects, and in this respect should not be the object of attacks or of reprisal. And sections 6 and 7, which we consider to be the most important for journalists, urges states to do their utmost to prevent violation of international humanitarian law against civilians, including journalists, and stresses that the responsibility of the state is to comply with the relevant obligation and the international law to end impunity and to prosecute those responsible for serious violations. And finally, it requests the Secretary General to include as a sub-item in his annual report on the protection of civilian in armed conflict the issue of safety. Now, sadly, as I said last night again, this hope seems to be getting thinner by the day, as UN bureaucracies are often reluctant to confront certain governments. In fact, since that fantastic resolution was passed, it was supposed to be binding, over 800 journalists have died. So we were also full of hope when the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution only recently, in 2013, proclaiming the 2nd of November as International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. The resolution, this one, was done by the General Assembly, but it urged Member States to implement measures countering the present culture of impunity. And that day was chosen in commemoration, the 2nd of November, of the assassination of 2 French journalists in Mali, in Africa, on the 2nd of November 2013. And it was seen as a landmark when it urges Member States to do their utmost to prevent violence against journalists, to ensure accountability, and to bring to justice the perpetrators of crime against journalists. Now, there is a story here worth telling about the complexity of geopolitics within the international institution, and the United Nations in particular. Because of our efforts and efforts of others, there were a series of consultations about this, which agreed on, in the first instance, on the 23rd of November as being the UN International Day to End Impunity. And this was an initiative that was driven by many governments. In particular, for some reason, the Austrian government was absolutely at the forefront of it. So it picked out that date because the 23rd of November was the day of the killing of 32 journalists in Mindanao in the Philippines. I'm sure you remember that event that took place, which was the biggest massacre of journalists ever in one place. So they agreed on the 23rd of November. And throughout 1 year, at the first date, it was commemorated all over the world. And suddenly, the Philippines started pressing buttons because they didn't want the spotlight on them. And with many of their friends in the UN, they created a condition until they changed their mind and they moved it from the 23rd to the 2nd. And today we're still going through a transition where it's not clear whether people should mobilize their strength on the 2nd or on the 23rd. And we, the IFJ, in the last November, we are in a quandary. And we started activities on the 2nd to end them on the 23rd. And of course, that is not very good because the focus is lost, people are doing different things, and rather than have the whole world discuss the issue of impunity on a particular day, we ended up in a worse position. I will just finish with a few things, talk a little bit about what UNESCO is doing recently. I told you about that big list, plethora of tools and instruments, and international instruments, legal instruments that UNESCO can use. Recently, because of the situation has worsened for journalists, they come up with an action plan. There is the last action plan. UNESCO's 39-member Governing Council started in 2011 to reach out to others who are allies in the cause, and they started with a series of UN interagency meetings on the subject, bringing together not only the member states, but also NGOs and governments and other UN actors. This is a new initiative, and it was endorsed by the UN Chief Executive Board. And there are many things in the plan. Nothing very radical, it just strengthens the existing mechanisms. So, is this the plan that is going to crack the issue of impunity? It is too early to know. And of course, at the end of the day, it's up to us. It's up to us how we're going to mobilize our members. The IFJ has got 600,000 members worldwide. So there is a very big budget, rather people as a base, as a start, to do the work. And the fact, of course, that the government is sensitive is the point. The neuralgic nerve should be pressed hard. And it has to be done by us. We must start holding impunity states responsible for their negligence. And in many cases, they're complicit. They have to face a persistent international campaign, not once a year, but every time they acquiesce or sanction or turn a blind eye on the murder of journalists. Now, I want to talk a lot about what we can do, what practically we can do, because many of these things, you just go to the UN website, you go to the UNESCO website, and you find all the text, what are the obligations of the government. The big question for us is how, as a representative journalist, and you also, union representing your members, you can do to make that happen. I will leave that to the discussion. I will come back to it because I still don't know whether at the end of tomorrow you're going to have some recommendation. If you do, I think we should pull together some ideas of how to progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim.